Miami lands its #1 target. Virginia and Syracuse still searching. North Carolina seeking its first ACC title since LT owned at Chapel Hill, and why not more for the Heels? And #1 imperfect, does Clemson still get a spot even with a loss? This is ACC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We like to say that we bring on the best bloggers that would be in the conference each and every week. That includes Brittany Taylor Newman from football.com, Dan Rubin from BC Interruption after a winless football season in the ACC, and Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC. Guys, thanks so much for joining us this week. Happy belated Thanksgiving, and I guess we kind of usher in the holiday season here. So that means a lot of coaching moves. So as soon as that last Saturday hits, then bam, it's wide open. The market for college football coaches, and no more so than this season, and some pretty high-profile gigs were open, at least at one point, with USC, Georgia, Miami, Virginia Tech on down the line. So let's talk about this Mark Richt situation going to Miami. Those are the reports from ESPN and also Kane's Insight. So, Dan, I'm going to pick on you first. So we're going to talk about a football program that won 8 games this year in Miami, still looking for a football coach, and they apparently have one. So the Mark Richt hire going from Georgia to Miami, how does it hit you?
I think it's a great hire. I love it. I love it from Miami. I think it's the right guy. I still have no idea why Georgia wanted to fire Mark Richt, because he is a tremendous asset. He's a guy who breeds success. When you think about what he can do on a football field, he's a guy who led Georgia to, I think, how many bowl games in a row? I think a bowl game every single time, every single year that he'd been there, dating back to 2001. Ranked 3rd in the country, ranked 6th in the country, ranked 2nd in the country. This is a guy who can do it on the field and produce NFL-ready guys, and he's got the proven track record to go in at the power conference level and really fix what Miami's been missing off the field too. He's going to be again a great asset. You think about handing down beliefs and from generation to generation and breeding success at the college football level and ingraining certain things in a program. And he's a guy who really eats, sleeps, and breathes that. So Miami's getting a proven winner on the field, a proven winner off the field, and when you think about the Hurricanes and the tradition that they have and of on-field success and even off-the-field success in some ways, in shape and form for them, or off-the-field notoriety, he's a guy who can really get that program on the straight and narrow. I think it's a tremendous hire for Miami.
Mike, we've had 3 consecutive years of Duke, Georgia Tech, and now North Carolina winning the Coastal Division. Miami's the sleeping giant. Could Mark Richt be the guy to wake up that sleeping giant?
Yeah, I think sleeping giant is the word that a lot of different people have used since the news broke a little while ago that Mark Richt was heading to Miami. But I think it's a spectacular hire, and I think I've already found my favorite to win the Coastal Division next year, especially when you consider North Carolina losing Marquise Williams, Virginia Tech acclimating a new coach and a new quarterback, and Georgia Tech, how successful are they going to be, especially after going what was the 3-9 season this year. So I think Mark Richt going to Miami is bad news for the rest of the teams in the Coastal Division, but taking a step back and looking at Virginia Tech, I think it's actually pretty good news for the Hokies as far as in-state recruiting is concerned, because there were some rumors that Mark Richt could actually end up at the University of Virginia, and so much for winning back the state of Virginia in recruiting for Justin Fuente. That would have made his job a lot harder. He would have definitely had his work cut out for him. Not that he doesn't now with Mark Richt being in the same division, but as far as recruiting is concerned, a lot of Mark Richt's dealings will definitely be in that Florida area where there are so many good athletes there. So I really like the hire for Miami. It's definitely a sleeping giant. They got Brad Kaya at quarterback. I mean, they're already a step ahead of everybody else in the Coastal Division next year. So I really like the hire for Miami.
Brittany, we finally get to you. So I apologize. It was a poor choice on my part going to these two guys first, but now we finally get to the brains and the beauty of the operation, certainly. So your thoughts about Mark Richt now moving from Georgia to Miami. We've kicked around the Canes on this show for a long time, but that may end next season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I gotta say, I'm not surprised by it. If you'll remember, kind of back at the beginning of the season, we did a video on Mark Rogers' YouTube channel where we talked about 3 teams that needed to start winning. Some antsy fan bases is what we called them, and we talked about Tennessee, Texas, and Georgia. And we said that this was the year that Mark Richt needed to win, or there was going to be trouble. So, sure enough, here we are. End of the season, Mark Rogers and his YouTube channel had it right yet once again. But I think it's a great, great hire for them, and I think it's especially advantageous because he's been kind of recruiting in the state of Florida already for Georgia, and then he's got those Georgia connections, obviously, from being there for so long. So I think that really kind of helps Miami right off the bat. There are some disadvantages that Miami has as far as, facilities, not having a stadium on campus, and the players get bussed over, things like that. So having a splashy name like that, I think, really, really helps them. I don't think it would have helped them very much to bring in a coordinator and to do the slow build. They already kind of have some disadvantages. I, for one, am excited to see that Miami, it appears, was willing to open the purse strings a little bit and put down a little bit of money. You know that Mark Richt wasn't going to come cheap. And that really is something that Miami's going to have to do moving forward if they're going to continue to compete with other programs. So I agree with the guys. I think it's a fantastic hire.
I'm going to break up the love fest just a bit. So excuse me, Mark Richt, family and friends. I think he's done a tremendous job at Georgia. They have almost flatlined 8 to 10 wins each year. So there's something to be said about that. I say that in a positive light, that he wins consistently at Georgia. Okay, we know that Atlanta, the metro area of Atlanta, is one of the most fertile recruiting grounds in the nation. So we will see if it was Mark Richt or it was the University of Georgia recruiting at that level, because he brought in top 5 to 10 classes consistently to Athens. My knock on Mark Richt is that here's a guy who you can only admire the character, the integrity, and I think that's very important for the hire going to Miami, considering the tradition or lack thereof when it comes to ethics and values and integrity. So he's a guy that is a first-class coach in regards to running a football program and running a clean program. So he's done a great job when it comes to that. He's won consistently. I cannot think of a time that Mark Richt has jumped up and beaten a giant. He has the better talent on the field 8-9 times a year. Then there's a couple games a year in which he has equal talent against the opposition. He typically loses those games, and then he just never gears up a team to pull off an upset. I cannot remember a time that Mark Richt has been able to pull off an upset. So I think he's a little weak in regards to breaking through a football team that is ready and primed and has the talent waiting to do big things. And his one opportunity recently was in 2012, and I think it was just an unfortunate situation that he had to face Alabama in the SEC championship game. He came up 4 yards or a couple seconds on the clock short, depending on your perspective, of most likely getting to the national championship and defeating Notre Dame to win a national championship. Overall, he's done an exceptional job, but those guys make so much money that winning 75% of your games and not being able to break through in a weak SEC East, I can understand why Georgia wanted to move on to see if they could pump some fresh blood into the program and break through with some big wins and compete for championships. All right, we go from success to Syracuse and Virginia. So does the panel have any thoughts on these two hires? Because I'm thinking on the surface that Virginia is not a bad job. So maybe, Mike, we kick it to you, because with your ties to the state and your familiarity with the program, Mike London comes in. He has one good season. His recruiting classes are pretty good, but Virginia can't get it done. They don't win. The offense has been atrocious for a number of years. Just your thoughts about the Virginia job and the type of coach that they should be able to get.
Well, I think they need to go the route that Virginia Tech just went and get somebody young. Sorry, all of you Virginia dreamers. The show is over. The party's over. Your dreams of Mark Richt in a UVA polo gracing the sidelines in Charlottesville. I mean, how realistic was that? Probably not very realistic. But I think now with the direction the program's been going in, it's just kind of been a downward spiral. They've been mired in, I mean, not even mediocrity. They've been mired just playing poor football over the past 3 or 4 seasons. But they need a guy in there that's going to recruit at a high level. There's a lot of good talent in Virginia. Mike London was a great recruiter, but the problem was he couldn't translate it into wins on the field. They just need a guy that can relate to the state of Virginia and has ties to Virginia as a whole, as a university. I think Al Golden is actually a candidate that's been thrown around quite a bit. He does have ties to Virginia. He was there at one point in time. I think he's a name that has been thrown around quite a bit. That would be an interesting hire. I'm just not sure that he would necessarily be the guy to resurrect the program, but I definitely think he'd improve them from where they are right now. I mean, they're just in the gutter of the ACC Coastal year in and year out. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a 9-win season, maybe you go for a young, trendy offensive coordinator. But if you're looking for a guy that will do a slow rebuild and get you back to consistency in conference play, I think Al Golden would be an interesting hire.
Dan, Syracuse, Virginia, any thoughts about either program and what the ceiling might be?
Well, I think Virginia is kind of right there now. I think if you look at a team that goes 3-5 in the ACC, you're going to find teams that are bowl eligible. I know NC State's 3-5 in league play. They went 7-5 overall. They're going to a bowl game. Virginia's problem was the fact this year that they scheduled so ungodly, and I know that we talk about it, or we talked about it a lot through the season, but you play UCLA and you play Notre Dame and Boise State, and those are, when you're trying to grow a program, 3 unwinnable games, especially the UCLA game on the road, and even more especially Notre Dame. So I think if you convert a couple of those games over to paycheck games, not another FCS team because you already had one of those, but you play a team out of the MAC, or you play a team out of Conference USA, or out of any of those any of those Rust Belt teams like the Georgia States of the world, or Georgia Southerns, Old Dominions, you're going to come away with more victories. And I think if you're Virginia, that's the difference right now between being a bowl team and not being a bowl team. They went 3-5 in the league, which was another year that they did that. It's 2 in a row for them. And like I said, 3-5 in the league, hypothetically supposed to get you into a bowl game if you schedule weak enough off conference. So I think they're right there if they can just iron out some of the things that were working against them. As for Syracuse, that's going to be a tough rebuild. They're a program that is incredibly hard to recruit for. It's not an ideal location for the conference for recruiting. It's not fertile ground at all. When you talk about the Northeast, there's not a lot of homegrown recruits from the New England or northern New York area for them to go. They have to reach closer down to Pennsylvania and try to go up against the Penn States of the world, which you're not winning those battles if you're Syracuse. And at the same time, you're in a brutal division, and anytime you have to travel, for the most part, in conference, unless you're going to Boston College, it's a long road trip, and that's something BC faced when they were the only Northeast team in the league for a number of years. It's not an easy job, and I think for Syracuse, when they're looking at a coach, they need someone who's willing to embrace all of that and work with it, especially because, like I said, when you factor in all of that, you're also in Syracuse, New York, which, when we're comparing different cities in the ACC, Syracuse, New York is offering you probably the least amount of anything anywhere. I mean, there's just nothing out there. So it's a really hard job, and it doesn't matter who they have. They're going to have a very big uphill battle at Syracuse.
Dan, way to kill us. So we have very high ratings in Syracuse, and they've taken a huge hit just now.
Those guys over at Troy Nunes is an absolute magician. Still are going to win our Orange Eagle trophy this year. But as a result, I love those guys. But they got basketball out there. I'll give them that.
Yeah, they're already shooting hoops, and they're glad to be doing just that.
Yeah.
All right, Brittany, I leave it up to you. Syracuse, Virginia, or you can talk North Carolina, Clemson, and get us started on that path.
No, let's go on to North Carolina, Clemson. Dan's already killed everything that I could have possibly said about Syracuse.
Hey, Brittany, I got a question here for you, because I think this is the most intriguing conference situation of any in the country. So we've got Clemson, number 1, firmly entrenched ever since the College Football Playoff Committee released rankings. We've got North Carolina creeping up the charts, trying to come back from that Week 1 loss to South Carolina. So despite all the teams in front of North Carolina sitting there at number 10, if they defeat Clemson, the number 1 team in the country, and they win a conference championship, which is highly valued by the College Football Playoff Committee, do you think North Carolina will make it to the College Football Playoffs?
I think they need a little bit more help if that's going to happen, a little bit more chaos. And we talked about this last week. I was saying, I don't think that they'll get, without a little bit of chaos above them, don't think they'll get that big of a bump with a win over NC State. We saw them move up to number 10, but they're still ranked behind a 2-loss Florida State team. So they're still 3rd out of their conference in the overall rankings. So I think if you see a team like Stanford losing to USC, I'm just looking at my rankings here. If they beat Clemson, Notre Dame's not playing this weekend. I mean, it could happen. It could happen, but they're definitely gonna need Stanford to lose, and to beat Clemson. If Alabama was upset by Florida, I think they would end up being able to steal a spot. I could see where the committee might take them ahead of Ohio State, but that's gonna be tricky. And I think this is such a defining moment for the committee. Exactly how much weight does the conference championship carry? And if that happened, if we saw that kind of a mess where UNC beat Clemson or Florida beat Alabama, which I think there's a much better chance of UNC beating Clemson, but that would tell us a lot. Exactly in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at strength of schedule, margin of victory, all of these different elements, where does the conference championship game end up falling? Is it equal or does it carry more weight? I think at this point, I'm kind of thinking that it could happen, but I'm giving it like a 10-15% chance of happening at all.
Even if they win. So we're assuming the North Carolina win. Even after they beat Clemson, you're saying 10 or 15%?
I think it would go up if they beat Clemson, because I think that gives them another jewel in their crown, so to speak. But I think some different things might still have to happen to make that happen. You've only got 4 spots. I mean, and if you've got a Pac-12 team, like if you've got Stanford still in it, I don't know.
I'm going to put on my powder blue here in a second. Dan, so if North Carolina defeats Clemson, so we're going to assume they pull off the upset because otherwise it's not a discussion. Mm-hmm. What is their shot of making the playoff?
I don't think they're in. I think the strength of schedule is going to be a problem for them. They only beat, in that case, 2 ranked teams, one of which was Pittsburgh. I think that when you look at their record, they played the 2 FCS teams. I think that's going to be a problem for them. I think all of that's going to come in, and I think that the committee will not value North Carolina over a 1-loss Ohio State team who is the defending national champions, or I just don't see it. I would be more likely to see a 2-loss Notre Dame team in there, provided Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame finishes 10-2. The committee will put them in there because they're Notre Dame over the fact that they're North Carolina. I don't see North Carolina getting in, even with absolute chaos.
Yeah, Notre Dame's not getting in.
If that happens,
it's going to be Stanford or Ohio State.
If Notre Dame somehow gets in, I promise you I will be the first one standing at the Zakim Bridge in Boston holding a sign that said, "This is on your hands as I'm going over the edge."
Okay. I don't have such a creative or eloquent way to state that, but I'm right there with you, Dan, because it's just not going to happen. So I'll be willing to do anything if Notre Dame reaches the college football playoff. Mike, what do you think about North Carolina's chances?
No, wow. I think they could win the game against Clemson. I honestly do. I think their offense is clicking as well as any in the country. The issue they're running into is the 2 FCS opponents they played and the fact that they lost to South Carolina in the opener. South Carolina had 3 wins this season. I understand it was the opener. I understand it was on a Thursday night, one of the first games of this season. But the issue that North Carolina is running into is their strength of schedule is so extremely soft. There are teams like Stanford in front of them, even with 2 losses that could beat a USC this weekend in the Pac-12 championship. I think Stanford is a better team than North Carolina, has more quality wins in their conference schedule to boot, because the issue you're going to have with North Carolina is, okay, you beat Clemson, they're the number 1 team in the country, but right now you're sitting at number 10 in the rankings. You have to jump Stanford, you have to jump a 1-loss Ohio State, Brittany already mentioned Florida State's ranked ahead of them with 2 losses, which doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I understand that they beat Florida, but if anybody has watched Florida over the last 3 or 4 weeks since they lost Will Grier, that is not the same offense. It's not the same team. Anything other than a Florida State win in that game. I mean, a lot of people were expecting Florida State to not necessarily run away with it the way they did, but they were a much more talented team when Will Grier is not in at quarterback for the Gators. I just don't see North Carolina making that jump. I think if the Tar Heels came into the week ranked at number 8, I think they'd have a more legitimate shot, but you got to go 6 spots. I think even if North Carolina were to beat Clemson, it would have to be by a couple touchdowns to even be considered for one of those top 4 spots. I think if they escaped winning by a field goal in the ACC championship game, the margin of victory is just not enough. Clemson's got to win against Notre Dame. What is North Carolina's second best win? It's against Pittsburgh. So I think that right there tells you all that you need to know. I just think there are too many good teams in front of them, and I don't think the conference championship in the ACC this season holds nearly as much weight as it would in years past. So I don't think North Carolina gets in, even if they do win the game on Saturday.
Okay, if I'm making the case for North Carolina, the Big Ten winners in, Oklahoma's in, Alabama's a huge favorite. They should win and be in. So there's 3 spots down. There's 1 to go. If Stanford wins, I agree with the argument that Mike made and a few of you as well, that Stanford has played a much more difficult schedule. They've won most likely a better conference. They would probably get the nod despite having 2 losses instead of 1. But if it's North Carolina against Ohio State, I think North Carolina gets the nod because I cannot imagine the committee selecting 2 teams from the same conference when there is a team, a conference champion, that won 12 consecutive games, defeated the number 1 team in the country, and the holy hell that the College Football Playoff Committee is going to catch if they select 2 teams from the same conference over a conference champion that's won 12 consecutive games and just defeated the number 1 team in the country. I don't see them pulling the trigger on that one. I think North Carolina would get the nod. And the strength of schedule that I saw has North Carolina at 62, Ohio State at 58, and this is before North Carolina takes on Clemson. So they're going to leapfrog Ohio State's strength of schedule. So regardless of what most people feel about Ohio State being one of the 4 best teams in the country, I think the selection committee would go with North Carolina over Ohio State. Stanford, another matter possibly.
You know, Mark, I just want to jump in. If North Carolina wins and doesn't get in, is there a possibility that this winds up forcing the committee to maybe expand to 6 teams or some sort, or look for other teams? I think that's the one thing that if I'm going to root for chaos, if chaos is going to result in that, then I'm going to jump in and say that would be a beautiful thing. I want more teams in that playoff. Then North Carolina gets in. Heck, put Houston in there. Houston, go Cougs. I'll put them in there too in the 6-team playoff if everyone wants.
We were so close to a ton of chaos. We can still have a little bit, but Hunter Henry, the Arkansas tight end, throws it over his head on the 4th and 25 on the last play of the game against Ole Miss, or Ole Miss is playing in the SEC championship game. Alabama's sitting at home with 1 loss, probably still gets wedged into the top 4, but not as the SEC champion. A number of things could have happened. Notre Dame could have beat Stanford last week. The Irish would still be in play. We could have had a few other things happen that would have made it a little bit more fun. I just can't imagine Ohio State getting selected over North Carolina. Although the committee is charged with selecting the 4 best teams, most experts say it's not close. Ohio State's one of the 4 best teams. North Carolina is not. So if they're sticking to their guns, 4 best teams, but that's a there's not a whole lot of criteria of best team versus best resume. So I got another one for you. Clemson loses, a heartbreaker, 30-27, last-second field goal, tipped pass, whatever it is. Does Clemson possibly still stay in the top 4? What do you think, Brittany?
I almost could see that happening before I could see. I feel like the jump for UNC to be able to go from where they've been to one of the top 4 spots would be so difficult. And I think it comes back down to the question that we just talked about. What do they value more, the 4 best teams, or are they intent on trying to represent all of the conferences as best as they possibly can. If they're going 4 best teams, if they're really sticking to their guns on that, I could make an argument that Clemson would still belong in that top 4. But the tricky part is I feel like we don't have enough information. Like we haven't got to see enough of this play out yet that we know what they're actually going to go with. So that's why we're sitting here debating which of these 2 things they're going to go with. And Dan, that's why I was rooting for Team Chaos last week, just like Mark talked about. I was like, yes, 8 teams. Please, 8 teams. But I think, Mark, it comes down to exactly what you just said. If Clemson loses last second, what do they value more, the 4 best teams, or are they really trying to represent all of the conferences as best as they possibly can, and obviously including the champions?
Clemson loses a close one, Dan. Do they stay in the top 4? Is it possible?
I don't think they stay in the top 4, and I think if then it winds up, I think they fall out of the top 4 pending a couple of other results. I think if that's the case, then Stanford's still your team to watch because they'd be the team that wins and jumps in if they win the Pac-12 because everybody, Pac-12 is a tough league and everyone doesn't want to be accused of East Coast bias, right? But I honestly think the thing that I see playing out the most and the most likely scenario for a little bit of chaos is Clemson loses, Michigan State wins, and there are 2 Big Ten teams in with Michigan State and Iowa. I don't think Iowa's falling out of the top 4, if they lose that game. I think the committee's going to put them in there as the 4 seed, depending on how that game plays out.
What?
I'm convinced Iowa's staying in there.
That's not going to happen, Dan. I'm sorry.
That is going to happen.
Iowa's been disrespected even as an undefeated team. Ohio State's got that spot. If anybody else from the Big Ten has that spot, it's pretty much consensus across the board. You talk to anybody that Ohio State's considered one of the 2 best. Vegas says that they'll beat anybody in the country. Now, I don't think that should be valued. I don't think that's relevant, but that's what Vegas says. And the committee is not going to take an Iowa team that just lost.
Well, they should.
To Michigan State. Maybe they should. And I agree. I would defend Iowa's case just like I'm trying to defend Clemson's case that losing a conference championship game as your only loss of the season shouldn't automatically knock you out of consideration. But in Iowa's case, it would.
All right. Well, then the Big Ten's still getting the 2nd team in if Clemson loses and Michigan State wins. Unless something really wacky happens with Stanford and chaos breaks out. I still only think 1 ACC team can get in, and it's Clemson.
Well, after you stated that, Dan, now I know why I saw on ESPN where Ohio State still has a 22% chance to make the college football playoff. As soon as I saw that, I said, are you kidding me? I thought it should be like 2.2%. 22% chance to make – they need Alabama to lose. I don't even think they need Clemson to lose. I think they should just anyway, we're not going to make the case for Ohio State. What do you think, Mike? And then we'll break down North Carolina Clemson.
Yeah, we're going to find out if the committee has a backbone or not, in all honesty. The issue that we have with this committee is what do they value more? We've talked about it over and over again now just in this very show. Is it a conference championship or is it the 4 best teams? If the committee wanted to put the 4 best teams into the college football playoff and Clemson lost to North Carolina by 2 points on a field goal as time expired, that doesn't mean that North Carolina deserves a bid over Clemson, who's beaten a Florida State, who's beaten a Notre Dame. I mean, I just don't think that they're one of the 4 best teams in the country, even if they beat Clemson. Their schedule, other than that, has just not stacked up. They've beaten 2 FCS teams, and they lost to South Carolina. I'm sorry, that loss still happened. So the issue I'm going to have with Clemson if they lose the game and North Carolina gets in is I'm not sure North Carolina is one of the 4 best teams in the country. I think what ends up happening realistically with the way this committee has been voting over the last couple of weeks and well into last season as well, is that if Clemson ends up losing the game, a very close game, I think a 2-loss Stanford is a team that could slide in, or a 1-loss Ohio State. But I think the 2-loss Stanford would get the nod if they were to win the Pac-12 championship. I think they would be the 4th team in with victories against USC twice and then also beating Notre Dame. I think that says something. And the schedule that Stanford has played inside the Pac-12 is much better than the schedule that North Carolina has played inside the ACC. So I think that's what would end up happening if Clemson were to lose a close game.
Okay, I totally get that. I get the Stanford argument, winning a championship in the Pac-12. Again, for me, it's less about who are the best teams because we don't know. If we could have God come down and tell us exactly who the four best teams are, we would know. But otherwise, we don't know who the four best teams are. We can only go by the four best resumes. So I'm all about resume and not who we think are the four best teams, because the same people who think they know who the four best teams are the same guys who miss like 30 to 40% of their predictions every week. So if they know who the best teams are, they wouldn't miss so many predictions. All right, Brittany, let's start breaking down this game and give us a pick on this one, if you will. Clemson and North Carolina.
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting game. I certainly think the Tar Heels could pull this off. They've played well all season since they kind of had that struggling start against South Carolina. What's interesting about that is, of course, last week, for a minute there, I was really worried about Clemson losing that game. I was surprised, actually, that they were tied up for as long as they were. And I'm on record last week saying that Clemson was going to absolutely annihilate them. So for me, this is going to come down to how on point and mentally prepared Clemson is for this. I expected them to walk in last week into a rivalry game knowing that they needed to make a statement win and kind of keep things going. I would expect that by all means they're going to walk into this game completely focused because they came close to losing everything last week for a minute, and hopefully that kind of put the fear of God in them just a little bit, because it could have all been gone like that. This conversation would be completely different if they had not been able to pull it together there towards the end of the game. So I think if Clemson's able to walk in focused, and I know that Clemson fans hate the term Clemsoning, but I think that is a huge piece of the puzzle for this Saturday, whether or not they're able to walk in focused and kind of rein in the pressure, bottle it, use it, harness it, or whether they're going to choke under the lights. And I know Dabo goes on a tangent about the term, but honestly, UNC has what it takes to be able to pull it off if they really wanted to. If Clemson's focused and is on point, Deshaun Watson knows that this is a game that the Heisman Committee is going to be watching, and he's trying to have another 400-yard game. He's been carrying the offense, fantastically towards the end of the season throughout November, kind of by himself almost. So if Deshaun is able to kind of keep all of that going, get the momentum going for a Heisman race, if the team is able to stay focused, Clemson should be able to pull this off. That's my pick.
Okay. If I would have tracked your records better throughout the season, I would know how much confidence, of course, to place in all of you. I'll put you all on alert for next year, where we're going to keep records. We're going to have something at stake. We're going to do it upright.
I think when you introduce us, our records should just be at the bottom of the screen for accountability.
There you go. And then I just moderate, see, and just make fun where I can pick and choose. All right, Dan, we get Clemson in North Carolina.
Well, the one thing I can bank on is that I went like 32-19 against the spread this year in my weekly pick'ems, which if gambling were legal in Massachusetts, I'd have won a truckload of money off of that. And then I'd be doing more of these with you and not working regularly during the day. If I had it'd be pulling a Jimmy the Greek on you. I think there's one stat that's really going to dictate the way this game's played, and that is the fact that Clemson's the number 8 ranked defense in the nation. I think the offense gets a ton of credit because the offense is 14th ranked. The offense scores 38 points a game. The offense can outrun everybody, but that defense is really good. And when you're talking about North Carolina has a top 20 offense that scores a lot of points. They score 40 points a game, 42 points a game, but they're coming in and they only have the 70th ranked defense. So it's an improvement over last year, but North Carolina's had a sellout for turnovers a lot this year. They're +9 in a turnover differential with a defense that gives up a ton of yards. They can't play on the edge, against Clemson like that. They can't say, well, we'll bend, not break, and go for the turnover. If that happens, they're going to lose. I think there's going to be a lot of points scored, but I think the difference in this game is going to be the Clemson defense. So I'm going to take Clemson to win it. I think that, like Brittany said, there's a lot on the line for Clemson. They've shaken the cobwebs of the Clemsoning term. They hate it, but it's still there, and it exists for a reason when people talk about it. So you might hate it, but you kind of have to accept it and work to make sure it doesn't happen. It hasn't happened yet, But now's not the time to have it happen, and I think Clemson knows it. I'm going to pick Clemson to win it all.
Mike, Clemson has been the consensus #1 team for the College Football Playoff Committee rankings since they took over the poll from the AP of sorts from Ohio State. Still undefeated, looked a bit staggered last week by South Carolina. North Carolina can make history in winning its first ACC crown since 1980 and possibly make a bid for the college football playoffs. Who do you like?
Yeah, I mean, Clemsoning is definitely a thing, whether Dabo Swinney likes it or not. And you know what? The issue with Clemson that we saw last week is that they let a team that they were much better than hang around. The issue they're going to face this week with UNC is this is an offense that can score a lot of points, and if Clemson goes out and makes a couple of mistakes, they're going to be in a situation where they're in a tight game late and might be on the wrong end of that score when it all shakes out. Now, what do I think actually happens in this game? I'm with you, Dan. I mean, this Clemson defense is #8 in the country in total defense, and they lost 10 out of their 11 starters off of last year's squad. So this is a team that, with Mackenzie Alexander on the outside, can lock up one of UNC's best receivers, whether it's Bug Howard or Mac Hollins. He's going to lock somebody down in this game. He's been terrific all season long in the Clemson secondary. I think that Clemson wins this game. I think they run away with it late. I think UNC's offense is very good, but Deshaun Watson, this could be a statement game for a Heisman Trophy. I think Derrick Henry is the clear favorite right now, but if Florida were to somehow stymie Derrick Henry in any way and slow him down the SEC championship game, Deshaun Watson has another one of these games that he's had over the last couple of weeks where he's had 300 or 400 all-purpose yards. Deshaun Watson could not only win the ACC championship and a trip to a college football playoff, but he will win himself a Heisman Trophy as well. So this is a huge game for Clemson and for Deshaun Watson. I think they show up. I think they make a statement and run away with this thing in the second half because I don't trust Marquise Williams. I just saw him at the beginning of the year. I watched the entirety of that South Carolina game. I've watched a lot of his games since then. He's still prone to turnovers, guys. I mean, he still turns the football over. And I think this is a game where that absolutely cannot happen. But this Clemson defense is just way too good. I think they'll force a couple of mistakes and pull this thing out late and run away with it. I think they win by at least 2 touchdowns.
This is the ACC Championship game preview of our ACC Breakdown. Each and every week we come your way and crank it up on Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time with the best bloggers in the Atlantic Coast Conference. Brittany Taylor-Newman from Football.com, Dan Rubin from BC Interruption, and also Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC. Everyone, thank you for jumping on board and helping me through this football season. We'll do it up again next week.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks, Mark.